Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out on a rainy night. I'm delighted to be back here. Did you know that there's a patron saint of murder? There are patron saints of everything, and there is a patron saint of murder. The 4th century saint, St. Julian the Hospitaller, who as a young man, when he was still in the secular world, attempted to catch his wife with her lover, and instead accidentally murdered his parents. So shocked was he that he converted to Christianity, and eventually came to be murdered himself, thus making him the patron saint of murder. He is also the patron saint of clowns. I don't know how you connect those two, but I'll just leave that out there. Tonight we're going to be looking at the connection between holiness, religious devotion, sacredness, and especially saintly devotion, and murder. And the connection is very close. We're going to look especially at 2 murders tonight. The first is by a little-known saint named Saint Moghold of the Isle of Man. Note that staff he's holding. That's going to become very important. And the other is the most famous murder in medieval English history, and it's the murder, there we go, of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29th, 1170. Both of these murders, in their own way, shed light both on the belief systems of medieval England, the religious beliefs, the cultural beliefs, but also on the way in which people thought about violence, the physical body, and the political or narrative importance of murders. So that's where we're headed this evening. But to get there, we first have to spend a little time exploring something that's called the medieval cult of the saints. And by cult here, we mean the devotional practices and ritual practices surrounding the saints in the Middle Ages. Saintly devotion was at the core of medieval Christian belief. A saint was your advocate and your patron at the court of heaven, right? So Jesus, of course, comes and saves the world, but everybody has to have their own personal saint who intervenes for them. The saint gives somebody a bit more of a personal connection with God and with the church. So every day is dedicated to a different saint, often more than one. People are named for saints, and that saint then becomes your patron. And when you ask for protection, you'll say, "Oh, Saint Andrew, will you please intervene with Christ on my behalf? Oh, Saint Andrew, will you help me accomplish this task?" And of course, the saint isn't a god, but the saint is your conduit to God. The saint is your advocate, and the saint is your spokesperson. And in this sense, we might actually connect the saints with an old pagan practice, and that is the idea of the household gods. Even today, people will have household altars to saints in their homes as a way of expressing their devotion to the saint whom they see as their patron. What's great, and what I always find interesting, is that even modern altars very closely resemble classical altars that you would find in houses, this is from Pompeii, to what were called the lares et penates. That is, the household gods, those gods specific to your house, whose job it was, much like the later saints, to intervene on your behalf, to care for you, to be your patrons, and to support your family, provide your family with the sort of supernatural and spiritual support that it would need to be successful. Now, the crucial aspect of saintly devotion in the Middle Ages is that a saint was very much tied to his or her body. And what I mean by that is the principal way in early narratives for somebody to become a saint was not simply to lead a virtuous life. Somebody like, say, a Mother Teresa, she led a wonderful life, but in a medieval sense, when they were looking for saints, they didn't look for people who lived long, virtuous lives. They looked for people who were martyrs. And here we have 2 of my favorite martyrs. St. Edmund there, whose shot is full of arrows. The text says, so he looks like he has bristles like a hedgehog. And then we have poor St. Bartholomew here getting skinned. For those of you who are fans of the artist Michelangelo and know The Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo actually paints himself as St. Bartholomew holding his skin. So Michelangelo felt a special connection to this saint. Martyrdom literally meant, the word martyr means to bear witness. And that's what saints were, people who bore witness with their bodies to the power and grace of God. Their bodies were not just a sign of their own devotion, their bodies were stories. Their bodies told stories. And that story was a story of God's grace and the truth of God's word. We tend to look at stories of somebody who, leads a heroic life and dies as somehow tragic. But it's important to remember that the stories of saints were not tragic. They were comic, and actually many of them were quite funny. Because if you think about it, a tragedy, especially in an Aristotelian sense, is about somebody who begins at the top and gradually travels downhill. A saint goes the other way. They begin in the mortal world and end in heaven. And so what you're supposed to do is look at a saint's body and think about a saint's body and allow that to be the spur for your devotion. That body will become your conduit to the next world, because a saint, of course, has 1 foot in this world and 1 foot in the next. Medieval devotion was centered around pilgrimage to saints' shrines. You would go to the shrine of a saint or a church that held that saint's relics, and you would pray there. That space would be, in technical terms, we would call it a liminal space, a threshold space, a space where from this fallen world, you would be able to connect with the spiritual world just a little bit better. You would just a little bit more be able to bind up that alienation from God that took place when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. The saints allowed you to do that. And their body parts, which were infused with their spiritual power, provided the touchstones that allowed that to happen. And so the worship of saints was not simply a spiritual worship or a contemplative worship. It very literally involved the use of parts of the saint's body, saintly relics. You might have a bone. Here's a reliquary with a bone from a saint's foot, a hand. Valentine's Day is coming up. St. Valentine's skull, going all the way to full bodies. So here is St. Clement, and here is St. Hyacinthus. But one of the wonderful things is you don't actually need to go all the way to Rome or all the way to Europe to see a saint. You can stay right here in Louisville. About 3 minutes from this building is one of my favorite places in Louisville, and it's the Church of St. Martin of Tours, where they have the bodies of 2 4th-century saints, St. Bonosa and St. Magnus. If you get some time and you haven't been to St. Martin of Tours, I really encourage you to go, because it is both a beautiful church and a historic church, and to see these saints in a place of worship really is a special experience. So that tells you a little bit about the way in which saints were understood, and especially the way in which saints' bodies were understood. To get a sense of the different roles that saints played, let's look Let's take a look at the miracles of St. Moghold, or as we're going to call it, the vengeance, the terrible vengeance of St. Moghold. Because remember, when you're dealing with saints, you're dealing with the divine, and the divine may be awesome and graceful and merciful, but it can also be terrible. Saints can be the victims of murder, but they can also be its perpetrators. People don't know St. Moghold very well, but the story I'm about to tell you is actually one of my favorite stories to survive from the Middle Ages. Now, Moghold is the patron saint of the Isle of Man, which is a small island off the coast of Britain, right between Scotland and Ireland. Man, during the Middle Ages, was an independent kingdom. And much of what we know about it comes from a really magnificent text called the Chronicle of the Kings of Man and the Isles, which, like any good chronicle, is a year-by-year account of the historical happenings in Man. And the thing about the Chronicle of the Kings of Man in the Isles is this is a very straightforwardly historical text. That is, this is literally about the kings of man and the things they did. There's not very much in there about churchly devotion, though we certainly hear about the founding of churches and the pillaging of churches. You certainly don't see anything about saints or miracles or magic, right? This is very much an earthbound chronicle, except for one moment. And that moment takes place in the year 1158. So we'll go back to our time chart here. Here we are, 1158, when a Scottish chieftain by the name of Somerled invaded the Isle of Man in hopes of conquering it. Somerled was not a king of Scotland. He was simply a chief, much like William the Conqueror. He saw the opportunity of invading a kingdom as a chance, essentially to give himself a promotion. So Somerled invades Man in 1158 and very, very quickly conquers it. This is a moment of tremendous humiliation for the people of Man. This is a moment of tremendous suffering for the people of Man. Somerled is not a kind governor. Somerled is cruel. Somerled is bloodthirsty. This is a moment of colonization in all of its worst forms. So how do the people of Man react? Well, according to the Chronicle of the Kings of Man in the Isles, the author says, "It seems to me appropriate to tell a tale now of Saint Moghold, our patron saint." And the story that our chronicler tells goes like this. Accompanying Somerled was one of his companions by the name of Gilcolum. There is no historical evidence that a Gilcolum ever exists, and I think that's important for what we're going to see in a few minutes. But accompanying Somerled was this fellow Gilcolum, and Gilcolum decided that he was going to pillage the church of St. Moghold, actually that very church, which was built in the 11th century. And so Gilcolum goes to Somerled, asks his permission. Somerled, being rather a jerk, says, fine with me. And word gets around that the next day Gilcolum is going to attack the church. The people who live at the church, the people who live on the church grounds, the families who are dependent on the church, not surprisingly panic. And they pray to St. Moghold. They say, "Please, Moghold, save us. Please protect us against these invaders." And Moghold grants their wish. That night, Gilcolum goes to sleep, happily dreaming of plunder. And as he sleeps, he has a dream. He dreams that he's visited by St. Moghold with his staff. And Moghold says to him, "I am Moghold, whose church you are trying to violate, but you will not succeed." And Moghold takes his staff and strikes Gilcolum 3 times upon his chest. The next morning, Gilcolum awakes, and he is horrified, stricken with terror. His chest is gripped with pain. And he says to his companions, "I have seen St. Moghold. I have learned the error of my ways. Please send for his priests so that I may repent." And the priests are sent for, and they come to the bedside of Gilcolum. And Gilcolum says, "I've seen the error of my ways. I wish to repent." And the priests say, "Sucks to be you. Turn around and walk out." At which point, Gilcolum is devoured by flies. Okay, so this is a really weird story for a bunch of reasons, right? Not only do we have this mysterious appearance of a saint in a dream, and this sort of weird, why is he devoured by flies? It's completely random. I actually give my students extra credit if they end their papers, and then he was devoured by flies. But also, there's that weird moment right in the middle there. If you're a Catholic or you know Catholic devotion, you know that the one thing a priest is not allowed to do is deny a penitent confession. So clearly there is something going on in this tale more than just, here's a great story about a saint. And what's going on, actually, I think, is this. Saints filled many roles in medieval society. They were not just religious patrons, they were also lords and protectors. lords and protectors. And what we have here is a story that's not just about religion, it's also about making war. The Celtic countries, so Scotland, Ireland, the Isle of Man, one common theme in early medieval Celtic saints' narratives and in early medieval Celtic practice, priests were also warriors. Priests went into battle. And so that idea of the warrior priest, the lord and the priest, or the lord and the saint, those were very, very closely mixed. And what happened in this case, when Gilcolm was going to pillage Kirk Moghold's church, the threat was not to the goods of the church. I mean, sure, he was going to steal them. But the threat that the narrative emphasizes is the threat to the people who are under the protection of the saint. And in that sense, Gilcolm was not just offending the saint as a religious figure, he's offending the saint as a lord. He made war on the saint, and so the saint made war back. Insofar as Gilcolm did not violate the church, but threatened to violate his people, his violation was actually a secular violation. And so it was responded to in a secular way. But why include this tale here in the Chronicle of Man in the Isles? Well, it's a mystery, but I have a theory. Interestingly, right at the same time the Chronicle of Man in the Isles is being written, all the way on the other side of England, at the monastery of Ely, monks are writing the history of St. Ethelthryth. You've all heard of St. Ethelthryth, though you may not realize that you have. This is St. Audrey. And you may be familiar with the term tawdry, that is something that is cheap and kind of nasty. The word tawdry actually comes from St. Audrey. Every year, the monastery at Ely would hold a fair, and the stuff that was sold there was known to be of pretty poor quality. So St. Audrey's Fair became known as the place where you would get tawdry goods. At any rate, the life of St. Audrey is being written at roughly the same time as as this miracle of Moghold's. And in the life of St. Ethelthryth, there's a miracle story. And the miracle story goes like this. At one point, the monks of Ely were being attacked by the local Norman sheriff by the name of Pico. They prayed to St. Audrey. And they know, the authors of this text know, eventually she will punish Pico. Immediately afterwards, though, we're also told there was another Norman persecuting the people of Ely by the name of Gervase. Gervase one night went to sleep, and you can probably guess where the story's going. Audrey or Ethelthryth appeared before him, smote him 3 times upon the chest, and the next morning he died. So what's going on? Well, pretty obviously on one hand, right, we're getting kind of a supernatural explanation for what happens when people have heart attacks. But also what we're getting is a historical story. Pico existed, right? A historical story in which the people who are writing the tale have been conquered, have been lost, have been wronged in some way. And the saint has not intervened to save them. The Isle of Man was conquered by Somerled. Pico was able to persecute the church at Ely. And so what happens? We write a fictional story in which the saint does get revenge. So that telling the story of the saint is a way of compensating or making up for the wrong that's been done in the historical world. And that gives you a sense of one way in which saints functioned. But I want to turn now and really spend the majority of our time this evening on St. Thomas Becket, because his is both a miraculous story and also just a simply fascinating moment in history. And appropriately, the gruesome death of St. Thomas Becket took place at almost exactly the same time as the tale of St. Moghold. It's impossible to overstate the importance of Becket to English identity. Becket was Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the patron of Canterbury Cathedral. You can still visit it today. It is, at least for me personally, this is my favorite cathedral. I've been to a lot of medieval cathedrals. This is the one I love the most. It is certainly the most beautiful in England. and one of the most important and most historic, because the Archbishop of Canterbury is, of course, the head of the English Church. And so this is where the English Church has been located ever since the conversion of England all the way back in the 6th century. And Becket has become the emblem of that church. Becket has been the topic of plays and poems. Becket is the subject of one of my favorite medieval films, called Becket, with the smoldering Richard Burton. And of course, most famously, Becket provides the narrative frame for Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Absolutely. The pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales are on the pilgrimage to the relics of Thomas Becket. Becket was listed by the British Daily Mail in 2001 as one of the 100 greatest Britons. The online religious journal Pantheon listed Becket as the 4th most recognized British religious figure. But in a BBC survey of 2005, Becket was ranked as the 2nd worst Briton of all time. Second only to Jack the Ripper. Obviously, there are some methodological issues with this study. I could make a comment here about Margaret Thatcher, but I won't. But this does tell us something, and that's the legacy of Thomas Becket is much more complicated than we might think at first. This is somebody who can be viewed differently from multiple perspectives, and how we view Becket and how we understand Becket's story says a great deal about us and the way in which we understand our history and our past. And so we've got to figure out what that story is. And our story begins on December 21st, 1120, when baby Thomas, this is Thomas Becket, baby Thomas there is born to Gilbert and Matilda Becket in Cheapside in London. Now, what do we know about Becket's family? The first thing we know is that they were not Anglo-Saxons. If you watch the movie Becket or read many novels about him, Becket, for some reason, is often portrayed as being an Anglo-Saxon under the Normans. He wasn't. His family was Norman. The name Becket itself, with that E-T, that's a French name. His parents were either of the very lowest nobility or the very highest of commoners. They were essentially of the upper middle class. Living in London, the wealth of the family was based not in agriculture, but in mercantilism and trade. And so they very much emblematize this new rising mercantile middle class in England. People who are urban dwellers rather than rural dwellers, people who don't make their money in the traditional ways that, a lord who had a manor would, but rather people who make their money through their engagement economically and financially with the outside world. Now, the King of England, when Becket's born, is Henry I. Henry I is son of William the Conqueror, and he is one of England's most effective medieval kings. It's under Henry I that the conquest of England is consolidated and confirmed, and Henry I is the one responsible for building most of the bureaucratic and governmental infrastructure that allowed the Norman Kingdom of England to be governed. Henry I is still ranked as one of England's greatest kings, but Henry I also actually led a fairly tragic life. In the year Becket was born, England suffered its greatest maritime disaster in its history. And it's the sinking of the White Ship on 20th November, 1120. The White Ship was a boat carrying the noble families of England from Normandy back to England. And on that ship were Henry's children. The ship went down. Henry's son was saved. But his son saw his sister drowning and dove back in the water to save her and sacrificed himself along the way, which meant that not only did a doting father, and Henry I was a doting father, lose his beloved children, but England lost the future of its government. There was no heir to the throne. So when Henry I died, of eating a surfeit of eels, you might remember, in 1139, it was unclear who was going to inherit the throne. And there were two candidates. One of them was the Empress Matilda. Matilda was a daughter of Henry's, who had been married on the continent to the Holy Roman Emperor and then widowed. And Henry actually picks Matilda as his heir, but he essentially surprises the court with her. So he hasn't built any support for her, and the court is, not surprisingly, a little wary of, first of all, being ruled by a woman who is essentially a foreigner, and being ruled by somebody to whom they have no natural loyalty. So another candidate emerges who's basically backed by the aristocracy, and it's a fellow with the very unfortunate name Stephen of Blois, because he is from, in France, the town of Blois. And of course, because we're telling an English story, we have to make French jokes. Now, what ensues is a terrible civil war that will last 15 years. It will be said that it's during this period, this war is so terrible, that Christ and all his saints slept. Now, it's important to think, like, we have a tendency to try to pick good guys and bad guys. These are two horrible, horrible people. They are feckless, they are dishonest, they are cruel. As you can see, they didn't have great confidence in Stephen's intelligence, which was justified. He was not an intelligent man. She was disloyal to her followers. She was incredibly selfish. These are two people who were basically destroying the kingdom for their own selfish reasons. And in fact, that's what they did. They essentially, over the course of 15 years, completely destroyed England and all of the accomplishments of Henry I. Finally, they reach an agreement. And the agreement is that Stephen will hold the throne while he lives, but when he dies, as he was childless, Matilda's son would inherit the throne. And that son was Henry II. Henry II comes to the throne in the year 1154. Now, what has Becket been doing all of this time between his birth in 1120 and 1154? Well, Becket began his life in London, and because his parents had familial connections, they were able to send him to a sort of mid-range but somewhat prestigious school called Merton Priory. You can still see its ruins today. Becket was educated there, and again, through family connections, he entered the church. And he entered the household of the then foreshadowing. He entered the household of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Theobald of Bec. Bec becomes Becket's patron. Sorry, not Bec. Theobald becomes Becket's patron. He sends Becket to university on the continent to study canon law. And Becket enters the church as, and this is important, a secular cleric. Becket is not a priest. Becket does not have the power to lead mass. Becket cannot perform the miracle of transubstantiation. Becket is involved in ecclesiastical administration. That's his job. He's a diplomat. He's a consultant. He produces legal documents on behalf of the church. He advocates for the church in court cases. So Becket is essentially, he's an administrator. He's a bureaucrat associated with the church, but he is a brilliant one and an incredibly effective one. And in 1155, 1 year after he became king, Henry II finds himself in need of a Lord Chancellor, which was roughly the equivalent of today's prime minister. Theobald recommended Thomas Becket. Now, Theobald's thought was that Becket, his follower, this member of the church, this guy he'd been his patron, would then go and be an advocate for the church at Henry's court. Exactly the opposite happened. Becket became a follower of Henry's and did Henry's bidding and carried out Henry's agenda. And Becket was deeply unpopular for this. And there's an important reason that says a great deal about the way in which English society was developing during this time. Henry, coming to the throne after a civil war, needed to establish his government. He needed to establish his authority, but he didn't want to be reliant on the aristocracy, because the aristocracy always wanted power for themselves. He wanted to centralize power, they wanted to decentralize it. And so Henry, he comes up with this idea, which is really a brilliant idea, and this is the source of the common law. What Henry does is essentially circumvent the aristocracy. Henry develops a special class of legal experts, people who are lawyers, people who are judges. These are people who come from the middle class. They are bureaucrats. They are people who have specialist education in the law. They are trained at law schools in England. And it's their job to carry out the judging and enforcement of law in England. These are your first career lawyers and judges. What Henry's done is created a professional class. And Becket, as Lord Chancellor, is very much a member of that class. So you have the church that looks at Becket and who thought he was going to be their advocate, and it turns out he doesn't play that role all that well. And you have the aristocracy who looks at Becket and is saying, well, this is this non-noble figure who has all of this power, and who has this power because Henry does not want to deal with us or respect us as the king should. Now, during his years as Lord Chancellor, as he was with the church, Becket proved phenomenally effective. Becket was the primary executor of Henry's plans for his government. Becket made it possible. As Lord Chancellor, Becket governed the production of royal writs, royal documents. He governed legal administration. Becket essentially was responsible for the domestic running of the Kingdom of England. Now, in the year 1162, Theobald dies, and Henry gets this brilliant plan. He's going to make Becket Archbishop of Canterbury. And he's going to keep Becket as his Lord Chancellor at the same time. Now, what happens here is very mysterious. Becket agrees to become Archbishop of Canterbury, but he refuses to remain as Lord Chancellor. And people have wondered why. And one story is that at this moment, Becket experiences a kind of religious conversion. And at this moment, he essentially rededicates himself to Christianity and the importance of the church. Another story is that Becket saw this as an opportunity to exercise independent power. Becket was, by any account, a deeply ambitious man and a deeply capable man. And so this was his chance to essentially have his own kingdom within a kingdom, have his own government that he could run, not under Henry, but in opposition to Henry. Whatever his motivations were, though, Becket was stepping into a deeply dangerous position. Because remember, Becket is not popular among the aristocracy, and he's not popular in the church either. When Becket is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, he's still not a priest. Becket is actually ordained as a priest the same day that he's ordained as Archbishop of Canterbury. So the members of the church, the bishops, the priests, they're looking at this figure Becket, and they're like, he's a politician. He's not a member of the church. He's secular. He's not spiritual. He's not trustworthy. The king is looking at Becket and saying, oh, this guy's, he's going to be my creature in the church. He's going to make possible my agenda and also my profits by ensuring the church is just funneling money into the throne or into the crown. And the aristocracy is looking at Becket and saying this guy is an ambitious upstart who doesn't deserve any of the favors bestowed upon him. So that's Becket's position then. It doesn't take long for Becket to fall out with the king. They have a number of disputes, but there are two that are most important. From Henry's perspective, Henry is furious with Becket because Becket maintains the financial independence of the church. Becket asserts that it is not the church's role to essentially fund the government and be subordinate to the secular government. So Henry's angry because Becket is not being an arm of his rule, and Becket is not using the church to fulfill the role that Henry wants for it. So on this account, Becket is a dynamic and bold defender of the independence of the church. But there's the other controversy. And the other controversy is over something called criminus clerks. Essentially, what happens when a priest commits a crime? Becket will assert that a priest cannot be judged in a secular court. Even if they've committed a secular crime, the priest has to be judged in a church court, which meant that they would actually have protection and be punished much more lightly than they would otherwise. So, priests are vulnerable to sin like anybody else. You have priests during this period going out, committing rape, committing murder, and Becket is essentially protecting them from prosecution. And on this account, Becket has no respect for the law. Becket has no respect for the kingdom. Becket only cares about consolidating his own power. The dispute between Henry and Becket comes to a head in 1164, when Henry issues something called the Constitutions of Clarendon, which is essentially rules or laws for the relationship between the church and the throne. Becket, at that point, is forced to agree to most of them, but he remains in opposition to the king. And shortly afterwards, Becket is accused of essentially malfeasance, of betraying his lord, and of embezzling the wealth of the church. He's brought to trial. At the trial, when Becket sees that he is going to be found guilty, he engages in a secret and daring escape and flees England. And it's a moment of, this is an incredible moment. Becket literally sneaks out of the castle where the trial is being held, using lookalikes, using disguise, makes his way to the coast, and sails to France, where he finds protection under the King of France. And he'll live in France for roughly the next 6 years. And this is really an interesting portion of Becket's life. In France, Becket will live his life at a relatively secluded monastery. And insofar as Becket had some sort of spiritual conversion, it's likely that that took place during this period. But at the same time, Becket can't just be a private individual or a solo priest. Becket is the head of the English church. Becket is a man of tremendous ambition who can't resist controversy. And what that means is that even though Becket is living a relatively secluded life, he is still an international figure. And his presence in France is a problem for the headless English church. It's an embarrassment to Henry, but he also becomes a figure for the tension between Henry and the Pope. Because Becket, as a priest, as an archbishop, is a representative of the papal church, of the papal crown. And so Becket, during this period, is also appointed papal legate to England, so that Henry, in his opposition to Becket, is not just opposing this one rogue priest or this one rogue bishop, he's opposing the power of the international Catholic Church itself. Becket will repeatedly be drawn into controversy. He'll repeatedly claim that he only wants to be a priest in seclusion. And he will repeatedly say, this is really the best time in his life. At the same time, Becket can't resist politics. Over the course of his stay in France, Becket will repeatedly excommunicate priests in England, bishops in England, the nobles of England, anybody who he sees as violating or challenging the authority of the English church that is rightly reposited in him as Archbishop of Canterbury. And actually, this is an image of Becket producing some of those excommunications, and this is an excommunication. So that's, actually the document itself. And what that means is that Becket is never far from Henry's mind. Becket is a challenge for the King of France to keep and maintain and protect. And Becket poses a problem for the Pope because Becket is also a sign of this particular political problem that, frankly, the Pope would kind of like to go away. And Henry would kind of like to go away, and the King of France would kind of like to go away. So what happens? Well, on June 14th, 1170, Henry II orders that his son, Prince Henry, will be crowned as heir apparent and actually co-king of England. Now, that's not actually going to work out. Young Henry is then going to rise up in revolt against his father. So Henry doesn't have great luck with children. If you've seen the film Lion in Winter, you know. Becket is infuriated by this. A king can only be crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. That is his prerogative as head of the church. If anybody else is crowning the king, if any lower cleric is crowning the king, that's a violation of church authority. That's essentially, in Becket's view, making the church subordinate to the king. Because there's always going to be a power imbalance if you have somebody like a mere bishop, or even just a regular old priest carrying out these functions. The king is always going to be more powerful. And for Becket, the church has to be independent, and indeed even exercising spiritual authority over secular authority. So Becket places the entire kingdom of England under interdict, which is essentially the last stage before excommunication, right? July 22nd, 1170, the Pope and the King of France arrange for Becket and Henry to meet. And this is the last time they will meet together in person. The idea is that they will, at this meeting, patch up their differences. It's a cordial meeting. And the king ultimately permits Becket to return to England. But any reconciliation is just surface at best. The primary disagreements between the two men have not disappeared. Becket will return to England on December 1st of that year. And when he returns to England, he will excommunicate the Bishop of London and the Archbishop of York, two allies of Henry, who are the ones responsible for carrying out the coronation. This news reaches Henry on December 25th, 1170. Henry's in Normandy at the time. Henry had a tremendous, legendary temper. It was said that he would become irrational when he lost his temper. He would growl. He would chew on leather. I mean, he just became almost primal and animalistic. And when Henry hears of these excommunications, he loses his temper and he cries out, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" And at this moment, 4 of the stupidest human beings who ever lived, 4 knights at Henry's court are like, "Oh, okay, we'll do it." Thinking that they will attract the king's favor, that they're doing what the king wanted, these 4 knights cross over the channel, they travel to Canterbury, they meet up with the treacherous clerk, and on December 29th, just before Vespers, they enter Canterbury Cathedral. Becket, at this point, is surrounded by his priests. He's preparing for the Vespers service. He's told that these knights are here. There's no secret what they're here to do. Becket knows that these are the final moments of his life. And Becket says, "I will not flee. Do not defend me. The church is sacred. The services of the church are sacred. No matter what else happens, we have to carry out the spiritual job of the church." Like everything else in Becket's life, this is a deeply controversial moment. On one account, this is Becket's apotheosis, right? This is the moment of martyrdom, a moment of tremendous grace. At the same time, Becket was at this time suffering from some tremendous physical health problems. It's very unlikely Becket would have lived much longer. He also, at least some have speculated, is suffering from signs of what we would call clinical depression. So is this a moment of spiritual sacrifice, or is it, in essence, suicide by night? This is a question that has, fascinated historians really ever since Becket himself died. Now, one of the most amazing things about Becket's murder, when it takes place, is that there are a number of eyewitnesses. And so we have a number of accounts of people who were there who saw what happened, including the account of a fellow named Edward Grimm, a priest of Canterbury Cathedral, who was right next to Becket at the time and who was wounded by one of the knights as he tried to defend Becket. And so he gives us his account. And what happens is Becket proceeds into the sanctuary of the cathedral and heads towards the altar to carry out the service. He's approached by the knights. The knights see that Becket is heading towards the altar. They get a sense that the people in the cathedral are very much on Becket's side. And one of the wicked knights, fearing lest Becket, should be rescued by the people and escape alive, leapt upon him suddenly and wounded this lamb who was sacrificed to God. He wounded him on the head, cutting off the top of his crown, not like an object crown, cutting off the crown of his head, which the sacred unction of the chrism had dedicated to God, the very part of his body that had been ordained by the sacred oil. Then Becket received a second blow on the head, but still stood firm. At the third blow, he fell on his knees and elbows, offering himself a living victim, and saying in a low voice, "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church, I am ready to embrace death." Then the third knight inflicted a terrible wound as he lay, by which the sword was broken against the pavement. So the sword, he wounds Becket, and the tip of his sword comes off and becomes actually a relic. And the crown, which was large, was separated from the head. So at this point, Becket's actual head is being torn apart by these swords. The fourth night prevented anyone from interfering so that the others might freely perpetuate the murder. And as to the fifth, that treacherous cleric, no knight but that clerk who had entered with the knights, that a fifth blow might not be wanting. Why would a fifth blow might not be wanting? Because Becket, as an emblem of Christ, must also have 5 wounds. That a fifth blow might not be wanting to the martyr, who was in other things like to Christ. He put his foot on the neck of the holy priest and precious martyr, and, horrible to say, scattered his brains and blood across the floor of Canterbury Cathedral. And he says, "Let us away, knights. He will rise no more." This is a moment of international shock. Not only has a high-ranking member of the church been murdered, but he is murdered in his own cathedral, just steps from the altar of God. It immediately produces objections, complaints. It produces criticisms. Henry actually finds his throne under threat at this moment because of the actions of these knights, who essentially followed not a command, but a hint that he immediately actually regretted saying. Henry did not intend for Becket to be murdered. These 4 knights have put Henry in a terrible position. And in fact, they will be hunted down and punished. Or if the ones that escaped were sent off to fight in the Crusades, where they died pretty horrible deaths. So Henry did not try to defend his followers at all, but this does not get Henry off the hook. And a year later, Henry will actually visit the church and visit the shrine of Becket. He will remove his clothes and allow himself to be whipped by the priests of the shrine as he begged for Becket's forgiveness. And this coincided with Becket being recognized as a saint. Now, again, this is a moment that it's easy to look at this moment and say, oh, this is Henry finding God. This is Henry finding a spiritual self. This is also Henry making use of Becket as an instrument of, you might say, political propaganda or political visibility to reconcile himself with the church. Now today, you can go to Canterbury Cathedral and you can actually visit the spot right here where Becket was struck down. There's an altar there, and there's a little plaque on the floor that you can't see in this picture, and there's this really remarkable statue, which we'll move here so you can see it a little bit better. This emblem is hanging on the wall. It's a cross with 2 swords that you can't tell in this picture, but they actually have red points symbolizing Becket's blood. The 2 swords cast shadows on the wall, so that they're actually the 4 swords of the knights who martyred Becket. It's a really, really special place. It's a very, very spiritually powerful place. Becket's own body was preserved as a saint, and his shrine became one of the central, if not the central, space of devotion in England. And it will remain that until the 16th century, when, during the Reformation, Henry VIII will order all of the Catholic shrines in England destroyed. And Becket's body at that point will be lost. It has, the records say that it was actually dispersed. So it was ground to dust and just sort of spread to the winds. But there still remains an important relic of Becket. It's held in Rome and periodically sent to Canterbury. And it's the bloody tunic that Becket was wearing when he was martyred. So, what can these stories tell us? The story of St. Moghold and the story of Becket. Well, the first thing they do is they reassert that thing we've been following on through all of these classes, the importance of the physical body, right? As I said at the beginning, a body is a story. Becket's body, which is one of the, his body is one of the most illustrated in the Middle Ages. It's not hard to go online and just type in Becket manuscript and just find tons of illustrations of that dramatic moment when Becket is struck down by the knights. Becket's body becomes an emblem of the church's independence, an emblem of a secular man's finding of faith, an emblem of devotion in its 5 wounds, emulating the 5 wounds of Christ. Becket is the quintessential martyr, and his body then is a target for all sorts of, or target for English devotion. It becomes very much a symbol of England itself, and this is why the pilgrims in Chaucer's poem, each of whom represents a different aspect of English society, are all together traveling to visit this sacred liminal space. Likewise, Moghold, striking down the body of his persecutor Gilcolum, a body that is so important that it has to actually be literally erased by being devoured by those symbols of Satan, the symbols of Beelzebub, the flies. Next, when we think about a body as a story, you always have to remember who's telling the story and what kind of a story are they telling. The story of Moghold is a story where the secular and the sacred interact in some surprising and interesting ways as a way of conserving or sustaining a certain kind of cultural identity, the identity of the conquered people of the Isle of Man. Becket, well, from one perspective, he is England's greatest spiritual figure, and from another perspective, he's one of its most hypocritical. It depends on who's telling the story. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, a saint is never just a saint. When we think about saints, these are not just spiritual figures or virtuous figures. A saint as a repository for devotion is also a repository for our hopes, fears, and beliefs. And what that means is a saint's story is always doing more work than it appears to on the surface. Much like the tale of St. Moghold, right? Moghold appears to be a straightforward saint's miracle. But it's also a story of politics, it's a story of warfare, it's a story of lordship, it's a story that's about a response to colonialism. The story of Becket is not just about one man's conversion and devotion, it's a story about the long and troubled history of the relationship between church and state. And depending on which side you fall in that binary, in that relationship, that's the Becket you're going to see. Our saints are not just our stories, our saints are not just bodies, our saints are ourselves. For next week, we will move from the world of religion to the world of the monstrous. And we will look at murders by things that go bump in the night, not murders by humans, but murders by ghosts. And so that's what's coming. Thank you all very much. And I'm very pleased to say I stuck to time.
If anyone has questions, you're welcome to use this microphone so open. Hear the question.
Absolutely. The other three? Oh, goodness. You know, I don't remember. What I do remember is, the question was, who were the three more prominent religious figures in that Pantheon survey? What I do remember was being quite angry, actually, reading it, because the Venerable Bede was not on it, which strikes me as a terrible testimony to the state of historical education in England. Yes?
So if Henry was the one who appointed Becket as archbishop, why did he not have the authority to dismiss him or appoint someone else?
This is actually one of the great controversies of the 12th century. And it's a controversy, it's actually an international controversy. Who has the right to appoint the leaders of the church? In fact, this is going to become so controversial that on the continent, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV will be forced to do penance for trying to appoint and control bishops by walking barefoot in the winter to the church at Canossa and waiting outside for several days until he is actually forgiven. The question of who gets to appoint bishops and, by correspondence, who gets to dismiss them, it's a question essentially of which power is greater, spiritual power or secular power. Eventually, the church will, for once and all, seize the power to appoint its own bishops. But during the early period, during the Anglo-Saxon period, kings appointed bishops. And by the time Becket gets appointed, there you have a real controversy, because Becket is not the person the church would appoint. And so, yeah, Henry appoints Becket, but Becket is not willing to give that up or allow himself to be dismissed. And that's one of the reasons why Henry says, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" Henry can't quite find a way of ridding himself of that priest. Other questions? What's the list? Were the first four there? Okay, the first four on the list: St. Patrick, not surprisingly, St. Ursula, Alcuin, who I don't know why he's not listed as a saint. Alcuin is a saint. The great 8th century scholar, and then Thomas Becket. But it's not an entirely positive list. Right after Thomas Becket is the bloody bishop, William Laud. So there are some rather negative church figures there. Yes?
Is there any evidence that, like, the, details of the story or the way it was viewed changed post, like, Protestant Reformation? Like, the Catholic Church being the villain of the story more, or...
What a great question. Some of you may have heard Becket referred to by a different name, Thomas A. Becket. That right there is really, that A is really interesting. Thomas never called himself Thomas A. Becket. He wasn't called Thomas A. Becket, in fact, until the Reformation. Why? Was a term of, right? Thomas of Becket. And so, of course, Thomas isn't going to call himself Thomas of Becket. He's not from a place called Becket. He's Thomas Becket. But meaning of, is associated with the lower classes. So think about characters in Robin Hood, like, Alan a Dale, right? It's the lower classes, it's the rustics who use instead of the more noble de or of. It's these rustics who are trying to say they're more important than they are. And in the Reformation, when they try to condemn Becket, they give him that as a way of saying, this guy's lower class, this guy's corrupt, he's an upstart, and that's one of their ways of condemning the Catholic Church. Your greatest saint, the guy was just a peasant.
Was there long-lasting fallout for Henry and the English crown from the Pope?
Yes, absolutely. So this will take us out of Henry's reign a little bit. Henry will never really reconcile with the church. And in fact, if you've seen The Lion in Winter, which if you haven't, you absolutely must, Katharine Hepburn, Peter O'Toole, it doesn't get better. Henry will never really sit securely on the throne again. His children will rise against him, his wife will rise against him, aristocrats will rise against him. Henry spends the final years of his life essentially trying to remain stable on an increasingly tottering throne. When Henry dies, he'll be succeeded not by Henry the Young Prince, because he'll actually have died already, but by his second son, Richard, who will become known as Richard the Conqueror. Richard has become known as sort of a hero. He wasn't. Richard is, in fact, probably the worst king England ever had. Richard had absolutely no interest in England. England was, for Richard, a source of funding so he could go fight in the Crusades. Richard only visited England a couple of times. He didn't speak English and had no interest in learning it. His wife, his queen, never actually visited England. Richard essentially drains the English coffers to go off and fight the Crusades. When he's on his way back from the Crusades, the idiot gets himself captured in the Netherlands and is held hostage, and England then has to come up with a ransom. So when Richard finally dies, he dies when he mocks a child on a battlement. He's like, hey, that kid could never hit me with an arrow. And the kid then, hits him with an arrow. Stupid deaths. His younger brother, John, comes to the throne. And John has a very bad historical reputation that's not actually really warranted. When John comes to the throne, he succeeds to a bankrupt kingdom, an aristocracy that has this long-standing grievance against the crown going all the way back to the reign of Henry and the appointment of Becket. And John has to try to balance all of these different political constituencies. John actually had quite a bit of interest in governing England. John is the first English king to have spoken English. He's also the first English king to actually have sat on a court, a regional court, and actually involved himself in the law. So John actually was in lots of ways a pretty good king. And he actually, the fact that he rules from 1199 to 1216, as bad a king as he seems to have been, he maintained the throne for 17 years. But John will never be able to reconcile with the aristocracy. And finally, in the year 1215, John will be forced to come to an agreement with the aristocracy, Magna Carta. And we often think about Magna Carta as this great document, but Magna Carta was voided just about 2 months later, by whom? The Pope. So yeah, the English crown after Henry II, it really never does fully reconcile with the church. And this will, of course, eventually culminate several hundred years later with Henry VIII. Other questions?
I'm just kind of curious where you personally come down on whether or not Thomas Becket is trying to functionally commit suicide by night. Like, my knowledge of this is colored by Simon Schama's account, so I don't know how well backed up that is, but, kind of points to one of the leader and calls him a whoremonger and turns his back on him.
Mm-hmm.
There's other things like, whether or not he was, and sorry, follow-up question is, how much did the local church kind of like him at that point? Because another thing that followed on to that is I thought that the abbot kind of made a joke after he was killed, something like he wanted to be king, now let him be one, and then they're like, oh, this is bad.
So yeah, there is the story about the abbot. The question is, first of all, where do I fall on Becket's death? And the second one is, how did the local community of Canterbury itself see Becket? So to answer that first question, honestly, I fall on the sacred side. It seems to me a bit ahistorical to think of Becket as committing essentially suicide by night. It's hard to find any other instance of something like that happening. And so if I'm looking at this moment and I'm trying to figure out what's going on, part of what I need is some sort of confirmation, right? Some sort of correlative evidence against which to measure this moment. We have other moments of priests or bishops behaving like Becket and essentially sacrificing themselves in this way. The idea of somebody essentially committing vicarious suicide in that way, there's not another example that I've ever run across or that anybody I've read has ever cited of that sort of thing happening. Now, even so, there's still a couple of different ways to look at this, right? Even if Becket was sacrificing himself, it's still a question, was he sacrificing himself out of belief? Or was he sacrificing himself out of ambition? There's a wonderful line in T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, his poetic play about Becket's murder, in which Becket is meditating to himself, and he's talking about his temptations, which were much like the temptations of Christ, right? The temptation of power, the temptation of wealth. And Becket has a line, and he says, the fourth temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. And that, I think, is a really interesting question. Becket, I think, is engaging in an act of sacrifice here. He is doing the right deed. But the question is, what was his reasoning? And of course, that's something we'll never know. The question then about, what about the local community of Canterbury? The local community of Canterbury was dependent on the church. The church was the main economic, cultural, religious, and political driver of the Canterbury community. And that meant that any sort of disruption at Canterbury was bad for the town. And Becket, as a defender of the church, he had been a good patron of the city of Canterbury. So actually, Canterbury is very much supportive of Becket. And they, you do have basically the equivalent of like, Western posses being called up after Becket's murder to chase these knights. But there are, this story you cited of one of the priests of Canterbury making this comment about, well, he really wanted to be king. There are lots of stories like that. Because remember, Becket's a controversial figure when he dies. And so there are lots of stories of people basically painting him in a negative light. Some of them may be true, some of them may not be. My tendency is to think that actually a lot of them are just like a bit too convenient. But that's one of them. Well, thank you all very much. Forward to seeing you for Ghosts next week.